Thanks for joining us today. I'm Ruth Fine, a health and science writer, a person living very well with ET, PV, and now myelofibrosis over the course of about 3 decades. And I'm happy to host this segment today for PV Reporter. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Kuykendall of Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa, Florida. Dr. Kuykendall is in the Department of Malignant Hematology at Moffitt, where much of his clinical and research efforts focus on myeloproliferative neoplasms, or what we call MPNs, which of course includes essential thrombocythemia, polycythemia vera, and myelofibrosis. He's dedicated to developing novel, disease-modifying therapies for these rare diseases, and he is the primary investigator of numerous clinical trials. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Before we get started with our conversation in this series called Patients Are Asking, I'd like to give a shout out to our sponsors, AbbVie, Insight, and Pharma Essentia, for their support for today's program. So Dr. Kuykendall, it's honestly astounding, and I'm sure you agree, it's astounding how much MPN research has escalated over the past few years. How many clinical trials have you participated in around one MPN or another?
Yeah, I mean, it really is really encouraging to see the proliferation of trials, and I think that it's just really been nonstop over the past few years. As far as MPN trials that we've participated in, when we're talking about interventional trials, we've probably been a part of between 6 and 9 over the past few years, in various different aspects.
Great. That makes you a pro, like so many others we have the pleasure of speaking to. And what I'd really like to know is, what are you most excited about? And that's specifically regarding clinical trials right now at more advanced stages, and either ones that you're participating in or just ones that you're following. What are you most excited about?
I think that there's 2 things that I'm really excited about going forward in MPNs, and I think from looking at it from a patient side of things, I'm excited about having a menu of treatment items for patients. Not just clinical trials, but just standard of care options. And I think that if we thought about that a few years ago, it just didn't seem to be a realistic possibility. But now I think in the next year or 2, we're going to have a menu of items that are FDA-approved therapies that we can talk about the pros and cons with. And that was more of a theoretical discussion a few years ago, where we were talking about pros and cons, but in reality, we didn't have too many available options. And now, we're reaching the real possibility that we're going to have several different options that may be better for some patients, worse for others. And then in addition to those, we're going to be talking about clinical trials, and that's really a much better place to be as far as being able to offer and really meaningfully impact care for patients. And then beyond that, I think we're also getting more and more to really having treatment options that don't all do the same thing. I think that while JAK inhibitors are great, that's what we've had, frankly, for patients. And when you look at later stage clinical trials, we're seeing really novel combinations that are putting JAK inhibitors in combination with other agents that have mechanisms of action that should complement that of JAK inhibitors and may be able to provide clinical benefits for patients that really didn't see a ton of clinical benefit with JAK inhibition.
Yeah, who might some of those patients be? What type of populations, specifically the late stage trials? Who do you
Yeah,
think
so
those most?
so when we think about late stage trials, right now I think by my last count there was 11 ongoing phase 3 clinical trials in myelofibrosis, which is astounding, but also incredibly encouraging. When we think about patients that may not benefit from our classic JAK inhibitors, as much, we're thinking about the cytopenic patients, the ones with predominant anemia and thrombocytopenia. We're also talking about, molecularly complex patients that have a disease that has a high likelihood of accelerating into accelerated or blast phase disease. When we look at our phase 3 clinical trials right now, we have not only momelotinib, which is in advanced stages of clinical development that may impact anemic patients who also have disease-related symptoms and enlarged spleens. You have pacritinib that's focused really specifically on patients with low platelet counts. We have combination strategies with pelabresib, which is a BET inhibitor that may be able to benefit patients with anemia and also improve upon what we've seen in terms of spleen and symptom responses. We have navitoclax, which has great kind of rationale for being used in the add-on setting, but also may be able to augment responses up front. Parsaclisib or parsaclisib as a PI3 kinase inhibitor. It really is quite encouraging, and this is kind of not even mentioning, or now I'll mention it, but not even to mention luspatercept as an agent that's already shown benefit in anemia and other disease states, now being added to the mix with both fedratinib and ruxolitinib combination strategies.
Yeah, combination strategy is where it's at, right? I'm in a clinical trial myself in a combination therapy, and knock on wood, doing great. How close do you think these therapies are, or any of them in particular are, to being FDA approved and available? Because we talk about them a lot, but I don't know if people are familiar with what kind of timing could be expected.
Yeah, I mean, so two agents within the MPN space at least have dates that are set on that. These so-called PDUFA dates, which is the date that the FDA has to make a decision because the applications have been submitted. And that stands for ROPEG interferon in the polycythemia vera space. So we'll find out in November if that will gain FDA approval for the treatment of polycythemia vera. And then pacritinib is actually has submitted and is also looking at a PDUFA date in November as well to see if it will be approved for thrombocytopenic myelofibrosis patients.
Hmm. So let's take a turn and talk more in a clinical setting for a minute. How do you measure a patient's disease? So is it primarily through blood tests, genetic testing, maybe a bone marrow biopsy? I know symptom assessment comes into the mix along the way, but walk us through how you evaluate a patient's disease and how that might be different today than it was just a few years ago.
Yeah, I think that when we're talking about myelofibrosis, where I think this question comes up maybe more specifically, I think there's a few different ways to measure disease burden or disease intensity. And I think that it's hard to measure something in one aspect of the disease. It's kind of like, dimensional, right? So if in one dimension you have a line, two dimensions a square, three dimensions a cube. I think that myelofibrosis is similar to that. You can't measure it just by the bone marrow. You can't measure it just by knowing a mutation or the spleen size or symptom assessment. It's all of those things to really get a three or four dimensional understanding. And fourth dimension, I guess, would be time frame, right? So, I think at any one stage, you can really get a three-dimensional view, but really understanding how that disease has changed over a period of time gives you even more information. And so typically, I think that not just disease burden, but disease complexity is important. And so, the first thing we're doing is getting kind of that three-dimensional view, which is getting a bone marrow biopsy, understanding the mutations that are there. For me, I think the two-dimensional view is just kind of understanding, is this a person that's dealing with disease-related symptoms, constitutional symptoms, fevers, chills, night sweats, bone pain, weight loss, fatigue? What are those symptoms? What does this mean for the patient on a daily basis? Then getting the physical exam findings, right? So understanding, is this causing an enlarged spleen, a big liver, or is there ascites? Is there other concerns that are going on that are related to this disease? I think that then that's kind of the clinical aspect. I think then looking in the bone marrow to see if does the bone marrow match the clinical symptoms, right? So are we seeing something that we could predict? And so oftentimes, since you've typically seen the patient before you've done the bone marrow biopsy or seen the results of that, a lot of times you're in your mind thinking to yourself, okay, what would I expect this bone marrow to look like? And then oftentimes when you see the bone marrow biopsy, you say, yeah, this correlates really well. But if it doesn't, then you have other questions to answer. And that's where this kind of third dimension comes in with looking at the molecular aspects of the disease and the mutations. We know a lot about JAK2, MPL, CALR mutations as far as drivers go, but these additional mutations we're increasingly learning have prognostic relevance as far as being a quote-unquote high-risk mutations, but they also have phenotypic relevance because we'll see oftentimes U2AF1 mutations or splicing mutations in patients that really have low blood counts and more problems with blood cell production. We'll see maybe RAS mutations in patients that have proliferative disease that aren't responding as well or as robustly to JAK inhibition. And so I think that really helps us understand that third dimension of why is the disease presenting the way it's presenting? What is it likely to do in the future? How is it maybe going to respond to some of the therapies that we have to offer? And I think over the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to say, okay, what's the best strategy of treatment for these patients?
Yeah, and how great is it that we can start to personalize, right? So let's talk about participating in a clinical trial. We set out in this particular program to talk about how, why, and if, right, about clinical trials. So how and when do you approach the topic with a patient?
Frankly, I approach the topic every visit with every patient. I think that many times, working at an academic center, one of the reasons people come to see me in general is because they're interested in clinical trials. Another reason people come is for disease education, and I think that it's important to educate people on the work that's being done in these diseases. As we mentioned, right now for myelofibrosis, we have two FDA-approved therapies, and they're, have the same mechanism of action largely. So if people want to know more about the disease and what's being done, a lot of times that includes talking about where this strategy, where our treatments are going, and what's actively being researched. At the same time, I really don't expect every patient to enroll on a clinical trial. Obviously that's just not going to happen, and so I'm very open with kind of the pros and cons of clinical trials and whether it makes sense, but that doesn't stop me from talking about them each time.
That's great. That's encouraging, because there isn't always that conversation, and we know that patients aren't always open to it. So how do people living with ET, or myelofibrosis know if there is a trial that they qualify for?
There's a few different ways of doing it. I think the easiest thing is to go to clinicaltrials.gov and just search the disease that you have or the disease you're interested in and see what's out there. That's not perfect by any means. I think sometimes it's hard to to spell thrombocythemia right and find that trial that's on there, or polycythemia vera, or you come back with 252 different options and they're not really actually options, and so you think something's open, or the sites that are listed as having that trial are not actually the sites that have that trial. But certainly that's a good place to start. I think the other option is asking your local oncologist or local physician who's treating you to do the same search for you and see if there's trials out there. Maybe they have a little bit of expertise there. And then the other thing is honestly going and going to videos like this, or going to YouTube, or different avenues to see who the experts are, and then try to search down from that standpoint. I think for me, I think that it sometimes can be challenging to know where trials are, what trials are, when things are open. My advice to everyone with an MPN is to, at least on one occasion, see an expert in your disease. And have that person try to navigate this crazy world, because I think even for my own trials, I think it's complicated to understand when they're going to be opening, and when are they going to be closing, and the trial kind of mechanisms are difficult to keep up with. So I would always recommend MPN patients to have an expert, someone who's in their area or somewhere that they visit. I know we have a lot of patients that, being in Florida, we have a lot of patients that we see in the winter, right? So they could be seasonal to some extent, but that person can be your resource to what's actually happening. And maybe you see that person once a year, and at a minimum what they can do is update you on what the research has done in a year. Maybe you're doing just fine, you don't need any changes in your treatment, but they can say, hey, this year at our big meeting in December, our big meeting in June, this is what we learned, this is what's happening, and stay tuned.
Yeah, that's really helpful insight. So I will put one shout out for actually with a new clinical trial finder available at both PV Reporter and the not-for-profit MPN Cancer Connection. It's free, and there's no personal information required, and I know that that's new, so check it out. Those advocacy groups, including PV Reporter, that do have a finder tool, it is much more user-friendly, and so check that out. The other thing that I think about is that, so let me go back. I actually travel every 3 weeks to New York. I'm about 3.5 hours north. And one of the things that I've learned that I like to encourage people to do is that I realize that everyone isn't able to get on a train and go 3.5 hours, right? But my physician, and like yourself, probably lots of other MPN specialists, have learned through the COVID crisis how important telemedicine is. And I would encourage people that if they can't physically see an MPN specialist regularly, reach out to them, because all or most of the ones that I know will do a televisit, and you can learn an awful lot from that, including what we're talking about today, clinical trials and they'll work in cohort with your local oncologist or hematologist. So, Dr. Kuykendall, what do you hear is the most common obstacle from a patient to even consider participating in a clinical trial? So one thing I hear people say all the time is that clinical trials are a last resort. A serious acute condition rather than the chronic nature of an MPN would warrant a clinical trial. So talk us through that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the connotation of a clinical trial is that they're considered to be a last resort. I think that doesn't really apply for MPNs. When you'd only have two approved medications, and we're looking at new novel things, it doesn't mean it's a last resort. Often these are things we're being used in the front line. Many of the clinical trials we talked about already are that are in phase 3 development or frontline studies. But there are, I mean, the two biggest obstacles are eligibility and travel. And that's really difficult to get around some of those. So when you have a heterogeneous disease such as myelofibrosis or any of these MPNs, it's not a one-size-fits-all treatment strategy. And a lot of the development of agents that's going on is looking specifically at one subtype of the group, or one like risk category of the group, or certain clinical manifestations of the disease. And you have to kind of meet those criteria to be eligible for the trial. And so it's tough when you have centers that maybe only have one or two trials open. It just may not be a trial that's the correct trial for you, but that's important. It's important from both aspects. We want to be bringing agents to the table that are going to benefit patients, and we don't want to be developing agents in patients that we don't think it's going to provide them a benefit. And so the positive thing is there's so many ongoing trials right now that there usually is a trial that fits a specific patient. It's whether or not that trial is available close to you. And that's where we run into challenges with travel. We have many patients that are motivated to go on clinical trials or clinical studies, but one of the first things we focus on in clinical studies, especially earlier phase studies, is safety, right? And so that's in phase 1 and phase 2, we're really care more about safety of drugs than efficacy. Efficacy, we understand that that's the ultimate goal, but first we have to prove that this is safe. And when that's the case, it requires frequent visits many times, sometimes twice weekly, sometimes a little bit less frequent than that. And if you live 5 hours away, that just doesn't make a ton of sense. And so I think COVID, for all the bad that it's done, the one positive is it's really opened up companies' eyes as far as trying to really minimize the requirements of being somewhere in person, and maybe opening up the possibility of doing some of these necessary labs locally as opposed to in person. But still, there's concerns with that, because we really do care about doing things safely, and it's just a challenge. So but those are probably the two barriers, and we're willing to work with patients. And I think there's some trials that are easier than others, and that's when you're interested in trials, I think the first things to ask up front is, do you think this trial is going to help me personally, individually? Is this the right trial for me? And two, okay, before we talk about too much about this, how often do I have to physically be here? Because if I have to be here 4 times a week, and I live 4 hours away, and I don't have the ability to, and they're not paying for housing during those visits, which some trials do, right? So that's something to ask about. But if it's not paying for the ability to get here or be here, then it's just not feasible, and we could move to more feasible options.
Yeah, I would encourage people to advocate for themselves or their loved ones as well. I know I was able to do that during COVID. As I said, I go to New York every 3 weeks, but during COVID, we were able to say, okay, you can come every 8 weeks and do some things locally. I think the important thing that as you mentioned, is it has to work for you, right, as an individual. So don't be afraid to ask for a little modification here and there. So moving on to a different subject, while MPNs are technically a definition or fit a definition for cancer, do you use that word with your patients? I understand that it's an arbitrary word, and I have a very strong feeling about its use, but I'm curious how you deal with that with your patients.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Yes and no. I mean, I think that we often avoid using that word, but at the same time, I think we have to use the word early on because I think sometimes patients feel like they're being lied to when we don't use the word. And it's, I think that has to do a lot with expectations, both from our end and patients' ends. Sometimes we try to avoid using the word cancer because we want to turn this into more of a chronic disease. We want to treat this more like high blood pressure, diabetes, hyperlipidemia, where we want you to live a long and healthy life, and maybe you take a medication and see a doctor for it, but it's not something that dominates your life. At the same time, you can't ignore, that this is a cancer, and you certainly want to avoid that situation where they go and see another person who says, yeah, this is a cancer, and they go, well, why didn't this other guy tell me that? So I frequently use it, especially on initial visits, and say, right off the bat, this is a cancer, this is a leukemia, but that's not how we're going to frame the discussion. But I do want to take the force out of those words and talk about the reason why it scares you when I say cancer leukemia is because when we think of cancer, we think of this, and we think of leukemia, we think of acute leukemias for the most part. And this is in that realm, but it's different, and these are the reasons why it's different. And so we usually spend a good 5 to 10 minutes with patients, in that initial visit, trying to take some of the weight and the significance out of those words and try to redefine them within the context of MPNs.
Yeah, that's
But
great.
yeah, I
Sorry.
don't know. I was going to say, I
No,
think it's tough. I think it's tough.
but your acknowledgement is really important because by the time they see you, or by the second time they see you, they've already seen on the internet that it's a blood cancer without the qualifiers that you can provide and without explaining the difference between a chronic cancer and an acute cancer. And as I'm aware, lots of people, who come in and get a diagnosis, after that first word they hear cancer, and they may not hear much after that. So how you're approaching it is really it's great to hear you say that, and I know a lot of other practitioners and specialists are doing the same. But I think it's an important distinction. I want to get to a few questions that were sent in ahead for this webinar. So a question from Don, who's an MF myelofibrosis patient. He asks, my present treatment with Jakafi seems to be losing its effectiveness. I'm considering a clinical trial for another therapy. Are bone biopsies normally required?
Yeah, without knowing the specific trial that's being considered, I would say bone marrow biopsies are typically required for clinical trials. Not always at the initial screening part. Sometimes if you've had a recent clinical trial or recent bone marrow biopsy for other reasons, clinical trials will allow that one to be utilized for the screening purposes. In later stage trials, registrational trials, a lot of times things have to be quite formal, and they will require a bone marrow biopsy at the beginning. But it's not a necessarily hard and fast rule. So I'd ask specifically about the requirements for that on the specific trial that you're considering. Typically on studies, if a bone marrow biopsy was done prior to starting treatment, they will be done at various different time points during the study. And the reason for this is we're hoping to be able to modify these diseases with some of these new agents. It's hard to prove that if you don't look in the marrow. That's where the disease exists. And so it's hard to prove that any medication can get rid of fibrosis or improve the way the blood cells look in the underlying bone marrow, and sometimes to do just correlative studies to actually get some of this science to kind of give us rationale for, how is this drug working on the bone marrow. We need to do those tests and get those samples.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we all know that bone marrow biopsies aren't fun, though. They can be done easier than other times. Sometimes they can be done easier than other times. But tell us a little bit more about the importance of it. So we can put in perspective, okay, I might have to have a bone marrow biopsy, which isn't pleasant, but how are we going to get to answers if you don't have a large enough cohort of patients who are willing to go through these trials? And how would you encourage people to participate?
Well, one, I think it's important to kind of let them know this is not something that we're doing just for our benefit. That this is something that we do think is important. It's like we're put in charge of Toys R Us or something. I hope they're not out of business. I think they might be out of business now. But anyways, it's like we're put in charge of that, and there's some sort of dysfunction as far as the toys that are being put in the respective stores, and you're asking us to figure out what's going on. They've got all these dangerous toys that are being put out there, and without being able to look at the factory that's producing those toys, we really can't figure out the problem and determine a solution. And then if we do come up with a solution, we can't really figure out if it's made a difference. And so, the bone marrow biopsy is where the blood cells are made. With every type of cancer that we treat, we're constantly biopsying or imaging, and we really can't image the bone marrow, and we really can't get a piece of tissue like we would from a breast cancer or colon cancer. That our tissue is the bone marrow, is the blood. So, we actually do what we can right now with peripheral blood values and spleen imaging and exam. We do a lot more than I think that that we would have historically with what we have now, and we do a lot of testing from the peripheral blood, but ultimately the bone marrow is where the disease is at. So we need to look there occasionally.
Yeah. Well, and there also can be some really good news in the bone marrow. I know in my case there is. The fibrosis is gone. It was there just a year ago. So it's worth sucking it up at times for a procedure that isn't fun, to be helping scientists and practitioners get to the answers that will ultimately help us, but also for ourselves, because it can be a hopeful thing that we find in our marrow. I have another question from Melissa. She says, I have MF, myelofibrosis, and my doctor is recommending a stem cell transplant because I have some bad mutations and I am healthy now. Should I consider a clinical trial as an option?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I would say the overarching theme of that question, which is there a benefit clinical trial versus a transplant? I would say we don't know the answer to that. Right now, the only curative therapy we have is a transplant, and we do believe that is beneficial in patients that have higher risk disease who are otherwise fit and in good shape, and it really offers a curative approach. Many clinical trials will even state in their inclusion or exclusion criteria that the patient is not eligible for the transplant or plans to undergo a transplant in the next 6 months. Now there's some vague wording there, but I would say that by no means would I ever consider any of the clinical trials that are out there right now to be a substitute for transplant. That being said, there are certainly reasons why a clinical trial may make sense in the current time as a transplant planning is ongoing. I think a lot of what we know about transplanting is that there's certain aspects of the disease that predict for patients doing better. When patients have very large spleens, that can sometimes affect engraftment, sometimes affect cytopenias. Sometimes when patients have heavy transfusion burdens, that can impact things. And so clinical trials that may be able to get better responses prior to going to transplant could be reasonable, but I wouldn't say it's ever a substitution or a replacement.
Hello, my name is Meredith Manning. I'm the General Manager of Pharma Essentia, based here in the United States. For those of you who aren't familiar with Pharma Essentia, we're actually a growing biotech company. We're Taiwanese based, and our primary innovation focus is on rare blood cancers. In the near term, we're hoping to bring a product to market that will address many of the unmet needs in the MPN area. For the past year, we've spent a lot of time building out the company so we can help support many of the needs in the MPN community. And we're thrilled to be a part of the community, and we look forward to continuing to partner with you. Speaking of the team members, I would like to pass it over to several of our team members so they can share more about what they're passionate about and what we're hoping to do in the very near future. I look forward to meeting many of you, hopefully face-to-face in the near term.
Hello, my name is Dr. Raymond Urbanski. I am the Senior Vice President of Clinical Development and Medical Affairs here at Pharmacentia. When I think about the diseases collectively known as myeloproliferative neoplasms, or MPNs for short, diseases such as polycythemia vera, essential thrombocythemia, and myelofibrosis, I see areas not only of significant unmet medical need, but areas of great opportunity. The opportunity to provide innovative medicines to patients, to caregivers, and to healthcare providers. We drive this innovation by focusing on the science. We are excited and looking forward to working with all of our colleagues in the MPN community. I believe that together our efforts will have a tremendous impact on the patients' lives. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Reedy from here in Boston at Pharmacentia. I head up the marketing and business intelligence team. And can I just tell you how excited we are to be a part of this growing MPN community? My team's goal, in part, is to advance the dialogue between HCPs and patients that really today focuses mostly on near-term risks and consequences of disease in PVera, to one that includes not just near-term, but near and long-term risks and consequences of the disease. And to do this, we need to listen to you, and we need your help. And we want to understand what you're thinking and your patients and your communities are thinking. Our mission here at Pharmacentia is to raise expectations on what treatment effectiveness should start to look like and what those conversations should look like. They should be focused more than just on near-term outcomes. They should be focused on both near-term and long-term outcomes of PVera. And we look forward to having more conversations with you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sam Lin, Senior Director of Business Operations at Pharmacentia. Just wanted to drop a quick thank you note to our friends at the MPN community. We appreciate the collaboration that we've had together for several years, and I just wanted to thank you personally. I know that this is really at the core of what's driving and what's important to us within our DNA at Pharmacentia. And more so than ever, moving forward, we're going to have the importance to be great collaborators and support this community. So wishing everyone a pleasant day and just wanted to thank you again.
Hi, my name is Kristen Griffiths, and I work on the public affairs team at Insight focused on MPNs. I'm very pleased to be here today to represent Insight, and I would like to thank David and MPN Cancer Connection for having me and giving me a few moments to speak about our company and its commitments to patients. A little background on Insight. Insight is a Wilmington, Delaware-based biopharmaceutical company committed to making a difference in the lives of patients through scientific discovery. Rigorous science is at the core of everything that we do to develop, discover, and deliver novel medicines that will meet the serious medical needs in oncology and other diseases. We are committed to providing better outcomes to patients through the medicines that we develop and the education that we provide to support the community. One of our most important commitments is to ensure that the appropriate patients may have access to the medicines that they need. For this reason, we have developed a patient program called Insight Cares to help support patients and healthcare providers access their prescribed medication. For eligible patients, Insight Cares offers prescription drug verification, prior authorization support, free drug and copay assistance for those who qualify under the program's terms and conditions, as well as ongoing education and support from a representative. Patients who have concerns about access to their prescribed medication should contact Insight Cares for assistance. Information for patient access can be found at www.insightcares.com. Once again, that's insightcares.com. And we highly suggest that eligible patients enroll in Insight Cares even if you don't think you will need access initially. Circumstances can change, and if an eligible patient is enrolled, we will be able to provide the individual assistance more quickly if needed. Regarding clinical trials, we are currently enrolling in clinical trials for MPNs. If you're interested in clinical trials, please contact your healthcare provider. Detailed information about Insight's clinical trials can be found at insightclinicaltrials.com. Once again, that's insightclinicaltrials.com. We strive to enhance the patient community to integrate an authentic patient voice through our initiatives. Partnerships like the one we have with MPN Cancer Connection have really been key in helping us understand the unmet patient need and caregiver needs, including disease awareness, and also providing a true authentic voice in the MPN community through the materials that we create. We host a website called voicesofmpn.com where we provide access to MPN information, patient stories, access to information on MPN community events such as Facebook Live programs, patient meetings, podcasts, and also a symptom tracker. So I highly suggest that you check out voicesofmpn.com to see that information. And in closing, I just wanted to say thank you again so much for giving me a few moments to speak to you today. Programs like this allow Insight to utilize our resources to help improve the lives of individuals impacted most on the diseases in which we work. So thank you so much and have a great day.